Baik. Baik.
Firmly standing as the cultural vanguard of West Java, Indonesia, nourishing the intellectual life of the nation, working for the benefit of the global world. This is Universitas Padjadjaran. Inspired by the vision of the Asia-Africa Conference, attended by representatives of 24 countries, the establishment of the university was the realization of the vision of the cultural figures of West Java to found an institution of higher learning in the cosmopolitan city, to educate and set forth to society dedicated and qualified individuals. Today, UNPAD has broadened its wings to encompass various disciplines and multidisciplinary academic endeavors through the efforts of 16 faculties and 1 postgraduate school. To achieve its mission to build the capacity to adapt and innovate in the face of the rapid development of science and technology at the international level, UNPAD is determined to become the center of research and innovation for the good of the nation and the world by continuously nourishing research and developing technology to create innovations in various disciplines. Currently, 36,000 students are registered at UNPAD, and more than 200 international students are registered in different programs, degree and non-degree. As an effort to constantly improve the quality of education, Universitas Padjadjaran is supported by approximately 2,100 professional faculty members with reputable qualification. To achieve the goals of its mission, UNPAD has also established notable research centers, which demonstrate serious commitment to and focus on achievements in a number of strategic fields, such as the Center for Sustainable Development Goal Studies, the Center for Environmental and Sustainability Sciences, the Academic Health System, the Center for the Digitalization and Development of Sundanese Culture, the Center for Innovation and Pharmaceutical Services, the Center for Nanotechnology and Graphene Research, to name a few. Equipped with a central science laboratory network and a science and technology complex in the Center for the Development of Science and Technology on the main campus, Universitas Padjadjaran has risen in its role as a leader in higher learning geared towards innovation. UNPAD also fosters collaboration with other institutions involving all stakeholders.
Universitas Padjadjaran commits to provide benefit and service for the good of humanity and the preservation of the environment. This is a great enterprise which cannot be done alone. UNPAD believes that in the spirit of collaboration, this vision may be achieved. We invite you who have the same vision and good intention to care for human life and the environment all over the world to work with us build collaborations, create a better world together.
Universitas Padjadjaran grew out of the community and has made it its duty to give back not only in the form of the dissemination of knowledge and information, but also through socially responsible activities such as student fieldwork, community outreach programs, and action research seeking to make direct impact on the community. With its feet firmly grounded in the local communities and environment, UNPAD is also making great efforts to take steps towards internationalization. It offers special programs for international students to maintain its global network and make its strategic and reputable place on the world map of higher education. As a site for the personal development of young minds and bodies, UNPAD supports a wide variety of student activities. UNPAD also provides students with libraries with an extensive collection of books, periodicals, and study materials, comfortable dormitories, health and fitness services, free on-campus transportation, and other supporting facilities which UNPAD continuously upgrades and improves. While being committed internationally recognized quality research, UNPAD maintains also its dedication in preserving traditional cultures as the compass for all of UNPAD's activities on and off campus. As of now, UNPAD have set forth unto society 200,000 graduates in various fields of work, including strategic government sectors and crucial multinational industries. Works for the good of society, bringing innovations and sincere contributions to humanity. Universitas Padjadjaran, the pride of West Java, working for the benefit of the global world. Universitas Padjadjaran, the pride of West Java, working for the benefit of the global world.
Indonesia is the largest archipelagic country in the world, with 2/3 of its area is the sea and has more than 17,000 islands with a coastline of 81,000 kilometers. Inevitably, Indonesia has the potential for extraordinary wealth of marine resources, especially in the fisheries sector. The lack of human resources to manage this potential is a challenge for a university in producing competent experts. Padjadjaran University, one of the universities in West Java, is here to answer this challenge by establishing a faculty of fisheries and marine science. Since 1965, Padjadjaran University has held higher education in the fields of fisheries science. Then on July 7, 2005, through a decree by the chancellors of the establishments of the Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Padjadjaran University. The establishment of this faculty is a response to the desires of the community, especially the people of West Java, to be able to produce experts or competent human resources who can manage marine and fisheries resources. Currently, we are given the mandate to become managers at the Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Padjadjaran University, facing the Industrial Revolution 4.0 with increasing challenges. Today's educational institutions are required to have agility and flexibility. We are committed to making this faculty a superior and internationally competitive faculty. We will strive to produce graduates who have 21st century skills, graduates who are able to communicate globally, graduates who have honest character and integrity, graduates who are easy to work with at the same time, graduates who have a high work ethic, as well as graduates who are easy to adapt.
In Jatinangor, we have 5 buildings, as well as outside of Jatinangor, we have PSTKU Pangandaran facility and a marine station in Indramayu. Our faculty has 8 laboratoriums and 1 library.
Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science has 6 study programs: Fisheries Study Program, Marine Science Study Program, Master Program of Marine Conservation, Master Program of Fisheries, and Marine Tourism Vocational Program.
Our curriculums consist of face-to-face learning, e-learning, laboratorium learning, which we do in our own laboratory, and field-based learning. Students were encouraged to enroll up to 145 academic credit with a graduation requirement or thesis.
Selamat datang kami ucapkan kepada Menteri Perikanan dan Kelautan Indonesia, Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono, MM.
Selamat datang kami ucapkan kepada Rector Universitas Padjadjaran, Ibu Profesor Dr. Rina Indiastuti, SE, M.SIE. Selamat datang juga kami ucapkan kepada Ketua IK FPIK Unpad. Ladies and gentlemen, we cordially invite you to sit in front of your devices because in a few minutes, the event will begin. For all participants, we require you to change your display name to the format of full name _ university _ country.
Hadirin yang kami hormati, karena sesaat lagi acara akan dimulai, kami meminta khususnya untuk para mahasiswa dan peserta untuk mengubah format nama sebagai berikut. Nama _universitas _negara. And now we're also live on YouTube FPIK Unpad YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe for more interesting videos.
Kami juga sedang live via YouTube FPIK Unpad. Jadi, jangan lupa untuk subscribe untuk menyaksikan video-video menarik lainnya.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace for us all. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science International Virtual Summer Program Opening Ceremony. With the theme of coastal vulnerability, prediction, assessment, and adaptation. And also the first lecture of the odd semester's that will be delivered by the Ministers of Marine Affairs and Fisheries of Republic Indonesia on Monday, August 13, 2021.
Selamat siang, Bapak dan Ibu, serta hadirin sekalian. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Selamat datang di upacara pembukaan International Virtual Summer Program Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan Universitas Padjadjaran dengan mengusung tema Coastal Vulnerability Prediction, Assessment, and Adaptation, dan juga kuliah perdana semester ganjil tahun akademik 2021-2022 yang akan disampaikan sebagai narasumber oleh Menteri Kelautan dan Perikanan Republik Indonesia, Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono, MM, Senin 30 Agustus 2021. Happy to be your master of ceremony today. My name is Fathan, and I am here with my partner,
Aisyah.
This is such a wonderful and precious opportunity for us to be your MC on this beautiful evening at the International Virtual Summer Program. First of all, we would like to thank you all for your enthusiasm because in total, there are 186 participants joining our summer program, representing 27 universities, and these participants come from 13 countries and 5 continents respectively. And also, we have 960 participants of today's first lecture.
Sebelumnya, izinkan kami untuk memperkenalkan diri. Saya Aisyah, mahasiswa Program Studi Ilmu Kelautan Angkatan 2018.
Saya Fathan, mahasiswa dari Program Studi Ilmu Kelautan Angkatan 2019.
Pada hari ini akan memandu jalannya acara. Pertama-tama, kami mengucapkan terima kasih atas antusiasme para peserta, karena hingga saat ini terdapat 186 peserta asing yang mengikuti summer program kami, merepresentasikan 27 universitas yang datang dari 13 negara dan 5 benua, dan juga 960 mahasiswa yang mengikuti kuliah perdana pada hari ini.
It is an honor for me to inform you that among us here, we have some very important guests. Those are
Satu kehormatan bagi kami untuk menginformasikan bahwa pada hari ini kita kedatangan tamu kehormatan, di antaranya
the Honorable Keynote Speaker at today's opening ceremony, the Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries of Republik Indonesia, Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono, MM,
yang terhormat pembicara utama untuk upacara pembukaan ini, Menteri Perikanan dan Kelautan Republik Indonesia, Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono, MM.
the honored Rector of Universitas Padjadjaran, Profesor Dr. Rina Indiastuti, SE, M.SIE.
Yang kami hormati, Rektor Universitas Padjadjaran, Ibu Profesor Dr. Rina Indiastuti, SE, M.SIE.
Vice Chancellor for Academics and Student Affairs, Profesor Arif Syamsulaksan Kartasasmita, DR, SPMK, MKes, PhD.
Wakil Rektor Bidang Akademik dan Kemahasiswaan, Bapak Profesor Arif Syamsulaksan Kartasasmita, DR, SPMK, MKes, PhD. Vice Chancellors of Research and Innovation, Profesor Dr. Insinyur Hendrawarman, MSc.
Wakil Rektor Bidang Riset dan Inovasi, Profesor Dr. Insinyur Hendarmawan, MSc. Dean of Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Sciences of Universitas Padjadjaran, Dr. SC AGR Yudi Nurul Ihsan, SPI, MSI.
Dekan Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan Universitas Padjadjaran, Bapak Dr. SC AGR Yudi Nurul Ihsan, SPI, MSI.
Director of Education and Internationalization, Muhammad Fahmi, SE, MT, PhD.
Direktur Pendidikan dan Internasionalisasi Bapak Muhammad Fahmi, SSA, MT, PhD. The Head of Faculties of Universitas Padjadjaran, the Head of International Office, Guest Professor, and the invitees from various national and international university that all the name I cannot mention one by one.
Para pimpinan di lingkungan Unpad, kepala kantor internasional, para guru besar, para undangan dari berbagai universitas, baik di dalam maupun luar negeri, yang nama-namanya tidak dapat kami sebutkan satu persatu. And we would also like to welcome all the new students of the Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Universitas Padjadjaran.
Dan juga kami mengucapkan selamat datang untuk para mahasiswa-mahasiswi baru Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan Universitas Padjadjaran. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's begin today's event with singing the Indonesian National Anthem, Indonesia Raya, and Hymn Unpad. To all of the audience, please raise.
Menyanyikan lagu Indonesia Raya dan himne Unpad. Hadirin dimohon berdiri. Thank you. Everyone is allowed to take their seats again. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear a report from the Dean of Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Sciences, Universitas Padjadjaran, Dr. SC AGR Yudi Nurul
Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono MM, Excellency the Rector of the Universitas Padjadjaran, Ibu Profesor Dr. Rina Indiastuti, Excellency the Vice Rector, the Dean of the Faculty among UNPAD, the professors, the leaders from other faculty, from other university, representative from the university partners who has attended the opening ceremony of the summer program and Kuliah Perdana 2021. I am very welcome to each and every one of you to learn with us. And as we know that Universitas Padjadjaran has a vision to become a world-class university. And to support this vision, Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Universitas Padjadjaran held this program, this international program with the entitled Coastal Vulnerability, Prediction, Assessment, and Adaptation. With the participants reached to 186 participants from 13 countries and 27 universities. 44 participants coming from Malaysia, 46 participants coming from Vietnam, 28 from Philippines, 25 participants from Indonesia, 17 participants from Tiongkok, 10 from Peru, 7 participants from Bangladesh, 3 participants from India, 2 from British, and other country from Egyptian, Irish, New Zealand, and Belgium. We hope that by this program, it will be one of the strategic to strengthen the collaboration between UNPAD and other institutions. And we hope by this program, we can introduce that Universitas Padjadjaran is one of the best university in Indonesia, the country known as the biggest archipelago state in the world. Indonesia known as the country with the reach of the biodiversity, the reach of the potential of the natural resources from the marine and fisheries. And by this program, we also hope that we can transform these resources become the economic value in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope we can enjoy this program. Last but not least, allow me to close my talk in Bahasa Indonesia, Pak Menteri dan Bu Rektor, bahwa acara ini juga di samping pembukaan internasional summer program, sekaligus juga menjadi kuliah perdana bagi mahasiswa Universitas Padjadjaran, khususnya mahasiswa Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan di Universitas Padjadjaran. Kami juga melihat acara ini dihadiri oleh mahasiswa dan pimpinan dari Universitas Mitra yang juga di Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan. Ini sebuah kebanggaan untuk para mahasiswa bahwa pada saat kuliah perdana hari ini dihadiri langsung oleh Ibu Rektor serta disampaikan langsung kuliah perdana oleh Bapak Menteri Kelautan dan Perikanan Republik Indonesia, Bapak Sakti Wahyu Trenggono. Kami berharap bahwa acara ini menjadi spirit, menjadi motivasi dan energi untuk seluruh mahasiswa untuk melakukan transformasi bagaimana kita memiliki sumber daya alam yang melimpah menjadi sebuah kekayaan dan potensi untuk pembangunan nasional di masa yang akan datang. Sesuai dengan pola ilmiah pokok Universitas Padjadjaran, bina mulia hukum dan lingkungan hidup dalam pembangunan nasional, dan akan memberikan kontribusi untuk terwujudnya visi Indonesia tahun 1945 yang akan membawa Indonesia menjadi salah satu negara maju dengan pertumbuhan ekonomi 5 terbesar di dunia. Akhirnya, Bapak Ibu sekalian, izinkan saya menutup laporan kegiatan hari ini dengan sebuah pantun. Pak Ahmad membawa ikan sepat. Ikan sepat dipotong dengan kampak. Unpad adalah kampus yang hebat karena sivitasnya inovatif, kreatif, dan sangat kompak. Nasrum minallah wa fathun qarib, wallahu muwafiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Billahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yudi, for the warm welcoming and reports to all of the participants here today. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move to the next session, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Rina Indiastuti, S.A. M.SIE, as the Rector of Universitas Padjadjaran, to give an opening speech. For Mrs. Rina, time and place is yours.
Oke, terima kasih. Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Your Excellency, Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, Republik Indonesia, Bapak Menteri, Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono MM, as our keynote speaker for this event today. Welcome and thank you for your presence here. Yang terhormat, Dekan, Dean, Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Sciences, Universitas Padjadjaran, Bapak Dr. Yudi Nurul Ihsan, and Honorable Speaker from Professor Michael Locke from Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand. Welcome to our campus. And honorable faculty members of Universitas Padjadjaran, especially for Faculty of Marine Sciences, all of the professors and lecturers, all of the invitees from various universities at home and abroad, all of the students, and all of the participants from various universities, countries, cultures, and backgrounds, and very special for the organizer of this event. Good afternoon, selamat siang, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our university, Universitas Padjadjaran, to take part in Faculty Fisheries and Marine Sciences UNPAD International Summer Program 2021. I am very grateful for the presence of all people here. It is also an honor, the first lecture for students of Faculty Fisheries and Marine Sciences delivered by our Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries Republik Indonesia. Terima kasih yang tak terhingga pada Bapak Menteri atas kesediaannya. Ladies and gentlemen, the summer program is held as one of many ways for Universitas Padjadjaran to become a world-class university, as mentioned by Bapak Dekan before. By this program, we improve the educational atmosphere at faculty, FPIK Unpad to be better equipped to reach the international level. We believe this summer program will not only increase the number of inbound students, but it has deeper value to initiate new network and open opportunities for universities' collaboration with Unpad in the future. Through this program, we also expand international network to improve collaboration. In terms of education and research in fisheries, marine and marine tourism affairs in the format of joint research, joint publications, international research consortium, student exchange, and other. This event would be a great opportunity to gain knowledge in fisheries, marine science, and marine tourism affairs. And on this very special occasion, I hope we can bring new experiences, new knowledge, new friends, and new relationship to all participants. I do hope you will share good feeling and that you will be inspired by the unique teaching and learning environment at the Faculty, Fisheries, and Marine Sciences Unpad Summer Program 2021. And now, I'm officially open this virtual International Summer Program 2021, and the first lecture by saying Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Have a great summer program. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Rina Indiastuti, for the warm opening speech for our summer program. It is such a blessing to hear your wise words today, because it will motivate us to do great for the next semester and during this summer program. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to the next agenda, we will listen to the March of Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science.
Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan mengukir prestasi tanpa batas, ciptakan insan unggul, jujur berbudi luhur, kompetitif, kreatif, inovatif, berbijak pada keilmuan, menjunjung tinggi profesionalitas, ciptakan efektivitas bekerja dalam kolaborasi yang bahagia, semangat untuk bermanfaat dan mendunia melalui karya dan prestasi yang nyata, menyelam hingga ke dasar samudra, terbanglah hingga ke tinggi angkasa, janji kami untuk selalu mengabdi bersama FPIK Unpad, janji kami untuk selalu mengabdi bersama FPIK Unpad.
Terima kasih.
Hadirin sekalian, acara berikutnya, mari kita dengarkan presentasi yang sangat istimewa dari Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono MM, selaku Menteri Kelautan dan Perikanan Republik Indonesia, dengan tema Transformasi Potensi Ekonomi Kelautan melalui Pengelolaan Perikanan yang Terukur.
Please welcome Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono MM.
Selamat datang kepada Bapak Menteri.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera bagi kita semuanya. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Yang saya hormati Ibu Rektor Universitas Padjadjaran, Dekan Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan, para guru besar, serta seluruh sivitas akademika Universitas Padjadjaran, para narasumber, mahasiswa, serta seluruh hadirin dan undangan yang berbahagia. Puji syukur kita panjatkan kepada Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, Tuhan yang Maha Esa, atas segala rahmat dan hadiahnya, sehingga siang ini kita dapat bersilaturahim dalam keadaan sehat. Bapak Ibu hadirin yang saya hormati, dalam rangka pembangunan kelautan dan perikanan berbasis inovasi dan teknologi ke arah ekonomi biru berkelanjutan untuk kesejahteraan. Pada periode 2021-2024, Kementerian Kelautan dan Perikanan melaksanakan 3 program terobosan, yaitu peningkatan PNBP perikanan tangkap untuk peningkatan kesejahteraan nelayan melalui kebijakan penangkapan terukur di setiap wilayah pengolahan perikanan. Pengembangan perikanan budidaya untuk peningkatan ekspor yang didukung riset kelautan dan perikanan. Yang ketiga, pembangunan kampung perikanan budidaya tawar, payo, dan laut yang berbasis kepada kearifan lokal. Kebijakan penangkapan terukur dibangun atas pertimbangan ekologi dan ekonomi. Terdapat 3 faktor yang mendorong kebijakan penangkapan terukur menjadi prioritas dalam pengolahan perikanan tangkap. Yang pertama, perlunya menjaga kelestarian ekologi. Yang kedua, karakteristik komoditas yang merupakan sumber daya milik bersama. Dan ketiga, masih terdapat peluang untuk meningkatkan produksi perikanan tangkap. Pembatasan yang diterapkan pada kebijakan penangkapan terukur akan memanfaatkan teknologi pengawasan yang terintegrasi meliputi pembatasan area penangkapan ikan, penetapan jumlah ikan yang boleh ditangkap berdasarkan kuota volume produksi per kelompok jenis ikan, jenis alat tangkap yang diperbolehkan sesuai standar dan ramah lingkungan, penentuan jumlah dan ukuran kapal yang dapat melakukan penangkapan, penentuan pelabuhan perikanan sebagai tempat pendaratan atau pembongkaran ikan, dan penggunaan ABK lokal. Kebijakan penangkapan terukur di setiap WPP dibuat agar pengelolaan sumber daya perikanan dapat mengukur. Yang pertama, angka produksi dan batasan penangkapan yang menunjukkan ketahanan ekosistem untuk mendukung ketahanan pangan. Yang kedua, nilai produksi yang menunjukkan ketahanan ekonomi. Dan ketiga, nilai pendapatan dan kesejahteraan nelayan yang menunjukkan ketahanan sosial ekonomi masyarakat. Bapak, Ibu, dan hadirin yang saya hormati, Kementerian Kelautan dan Perikanan menetapkan 3 zona sebagai implementasi kebijakan penangkapan terukur. Pertama, zona penangkapan terukur fishing industry di WPP 711, 572, 573, 716, 717, 718, 715, di mana penentuan jumlah ikan yang ditangkap melalui sistem kuota. Yang kedua, zona wilayah terbatas dan nursery ground di WPP 714. Ketiga, zona bebas penangkapan, yakni di WPP 571, 712, 713. Di mana pada zona tersebut tidak diberlakukan kuota penangkapan. Zonasi tersebut merupakan salah satu implementasi keterukuran dalam bentuk spasial dalam mengelola sektor berbasis sumber daya ini. Sebagai langkah awal, KKP akan menerapkan kebijakan penangkapan terukur di WPP NRI 715, sebagian dari WPNRI 718. Kapasitas tangkapan di zona yang dibolehkan atau JTB di zona tersebut adalah 1,8 juta ton. Dari JTB tersebut, peluang nilai produksi untuk dimanfaatkan di wilayah tersebut adalah 46,12 triliun per tahun. Saat ini KKP sedang menyiapkan sistem teknologi berbasis satelit yang terintegrasi. Teknologi yang terintegrasi ini akan diterapkan pada sistem pengawasan menggunakan integrated surveillance system dan intercept oleh kapal pengawas. Pola operasi di WPP NRI 718 menggunakan pola operasi penyekatan oleh kapal pengawas di perbatasan WPP NRI 714 dan 715 serta perbatasan negara tetangga. Suplai pasar domestik maupun ekspor nantinya dapat dilakukan dari pelabuhan tempat ikan didaratkan atau melalui pelabuhan hub yang berada di WPP tersebut. Kapal angkut yang digunakan harus dilengkapi dengan kontainer dingin. Ilustrasi bisnis proses yang akan terbentuk di area penangkapan terukur di WPP NRI 715 sebagian dan WPP NRI 718 akan menciptakan lapangan kerja yang besar dan perkiraan perputaran uang sebesar 109,8 triliun per tahun. Bapak, Ibu, dan hadirin yang saya hormati, kebijakan penangkapan terukur akan memiliki multiplier efek bagi pembangunan nasional. Selain sebagai penopang ketahanan pangan, kebijakan ini akan memberikan manfaat dengan pengelolaan sumber daya laut yang baik dengan tetap menjaga kelestarian ekologi, penambahan angka dan angkatan kerja dengan menciptakan lapangan kerja yang besar dari jenis-jenis lapangan kerja di sektor kelautan dan perikanan, meningkatnya distribusi ekonomi di masing-masing daerah, meningkatnya kontribusi ekonomi di sektor kelautan dan perikanan. Harapan ke depan, implementasi kebijakan penangkapan terukur ini dapat mewujudkan laut yang sehat, laut yang bersih, laut yang tangguh, laut yang aman, dan laut yang produktif untuk Indonesia makmur. Akhir kata, saya mengajak para generasi muda, utamanya mahasiswa-mahasiswi, peserta kuliah perdana hari ini untuk terus mengasah diri menjadi yang terbaik sehingga siap untuk berkompetisi dalam arus globalisasi. Tetap memiliki kepribadian yang baik, bertanggung jawab dan amanah. Kelak saudara-saudari yang akan meneruskan mengelola sumber daya alam Indonesia. Terima kasih. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi 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 Om.
Terima kasih Bapak Menteri Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono atas presentasi yang luar biasa. Semoga kita dapat mengelola potensi kelautan dengan baik dan benar.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to the next agenda, we will carry out a photo session. Therefore, we request all participants to activate your cameras.
Hadirin sekalian, sebelum melanjutkan ke acara berikutnya, kita akan melakukan sesi foto bersama. Oleh karena itu, kami mohon kepada seluruh peserta untuk mengaktifkan kamera. Kami akan memberi waktu beberapa menit untuk bersiap-siap pada hitungan ketiga. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, Mr. Operator. Hadirin sekalian, acara kuliah perdana semester ganjil tahun akademik 2021 Fakultas Perikanan dan Ilmu Kelautan Universitas Padjadjaran telah selesai dilaksanakan. Dan sebelum kita beralih ke acara berikutnya, yaitu Summer Program, mohon kepada mahasiswa yang tidak mengikuti Summer Program untuk meninggalkan Zoom meeting, dan kepada peserta Summer Program dan tamu undangan untuk tetap di ruangan Zoom. Terima kasih banyak telah menghadiri kuliah pertama kami hari ini. Sampai bertemu di kesempatan lainnya.
Kasih Pak. Ini udah di mute belum?
Terima kasih atas kehadirannya Bapak Menteri, Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono. Terima kasih juga atas kehadirannya untuk Ibu Rector, Profesor.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next agenda will be a very special session. Therefore, we would like to give you an amazing dance performance from Lises Unpad. Please be seated and enjoy the Tari Merak performance.
For all the participants, later on we have another performance. So please enjoy this one and stay tuned for another performance.
beautiful performance. Thank you to our lovely students who have given us such a wonderful art performance.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the next session, I would like to invite Mrs. Fitri Melianawati Pratewi, PhD, as Project Officer of the International Virtual Summer Program, to give reports about the summer program. Please welcome Mrs. Fitri.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the Minister of Marine Affairs of Fisheries, Republic of Indonesia, and also Rector of Universitas Padjadjaran, and a Vice Rector for Academic and Student Affairs, Vice Rector of Research and Innovation of Universitas Padjadjaran. And I would like to thank also to the Dean Faculty of Fisheries and Marine Science, Dr. Yudi Nur Ihsan, to provide us this great summer program. And I would like to welcome to all participants from all over the world, and Honorable Speaker, Professor Michael Luke from Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual international summer program. This international summer program is one of the most precious gems in our university. In span of 2 hectic weeks, you will make an imprint on our campus and our academic communities. Based on this data, for about 186 participants from 27 universities, diverse widely from 13 countries respectively, and also spread from 5 continents. There are 45 from Malaysia, 46 from Vietnam, 28 from Philippines, 25 from Indonesia, 17 from China, 10 from Peru, 7 from Bangladesh, 3 from India, 2 from United Kingdom, 1 from Egypt, 1 from Ireland, 1 from New Zealand, 1 from Belgium, based on the nationality. And there are 27, or actually 28 participants from Sher Bangla Agricultural University, Guangzhou University for Nationalities, University Technology Malaysia, Jindal Global University, Universitas Udayana Indonesia, IPB University Indonesia, Universitas Hasanuddin Indonesia, Sriwijaya University Indonesia, TNC Indonesia, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, University College Cork, University of Science Malaysia, University Malaysia Trenggono, University Malaysia Sabah, Auckland University of Technology, Quirino State University, Biriran Province State University, University of Asia and the Pacific, Southern Leyte State University, Samar State University, Nha Trang University, Hu University, Vietnam National University of Agriculture, University Tun Hussein on Malaysia, Dhaka University, and also Universitas Padjadjaran. We are very happy that you can participate from this virtual international summer program. And also, I would like to thank to the representative from 27 university that attending this opening ceremony of this summer program. And from 2 weeks, we have invited speakers from aboard. First, we have Professor Michael Luke from Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand, Dr. Zarina Wahid from University Malaysia Sabah, Associate Professor Lim Leong Seng from University Malaysia Sabah, Professor Andrea Alvaro from Auckland University of Technology, New Zealand, Dr. Fifi Hanisdah Saikim from University Malaysia Sabah, Professor Noel Holmgren from Swedish University of Agricultural Science, Sweden. Besides that, we have a lecturer from Universitas Padjadjaran and Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, Profesor Dr. Susiana, M.SIE, Dr. Yudi Nurul Ihsan, SPI, M.SIE, Dr. Insinyurita Rostika, MP, Dr. Atikah Nurhayati, SP, MP, Noir Primadona Purba, SPI, M.SIE, Fitri Rahma Fitria, SP, M.SIE, and Dewi Tunggarini, SS, M. Park. So between 2 weeks virtual international summer program, we have 8 main topics here. First, we have marine tourism and wildlife, bioeconomic modeling approach for marine sustainable management, integrated marine conservation and coastal management, mitigation, aquaculture, biotechnology, mariculture in tourism, impact of marine tourism, climate and environmental change, culinary tourism from sea to tummy, innovative business and administration in marine business tourism industries. Besides these main topics, we also have some activities for you, such as fun activities, flash mob, field tour trip to one of the wonderful marine tourism in West Java, Indonesia, such as Batu Karas and Pangandaran. And also, we have a virtual trip to Pulau Biawak in West Java and some virtual diving to one of the best spots in Indonesia. And we have a virtual experience such as painting batik and also playing angklung. Besides that, we hope that the participant can enjoy this summer program and participate in some focus group discussion and doing final project presentation and international student cultural exchange in the end of this summer program. The participants will access the one of our learning management system called MUUC, or Massive Open Online Course provided by our university, Universitas Padjadjaran. And also the participant can join the Zoom by synchronous meeting. And this MUUC is model for delivering learning content online to any person who wants to take a course. So from wherever you are, you can access this MUUC. Just enroll the course and put the enrollment key, and you can access freely about the contents, materials, and also the focus discussion. So in the end, I hope you all can enjoy this program, and I hope this program can be the unforgettable moment for you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a 5-minute break before our lecture session. Please enjoy your break and stay tuned for the next session. All participants are pleased to have drink while we are waiting for the first lecture from Professor Michael Luke from Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. For now, let's enjoy this Indonesia traditional dance,
Rampak Kendang. Hello everyone. Welcome back to our International Virtual Summer Program. Before we start, to Professor Mika, are you already with us here in this Zoom meeting?
Yes, I am here. Hello.
Hello, welcome Professor Michael. Okay, so without wasting more time, let's welcome our amazing speaker for the first lecture of the International Virtual Summer Program. Coming all the way from New Zealand, here we have Professor Michael Luke.
Professor, before you start, you have total of 100 minutes of lectures, including discussion. So if any participant have a question later, the participant may raise their hands and you may answer the questions.
Okay, also Professor Mika is a professor of tourism at Auckland University of Technology and Tourism. He is currently expertise in marine tourism, and by following this lecture, we hope you all will get a lot of knowledge on marine tourism and wildlife. To Professor Michael, the time is yours.
Kia ora, koto katoa. Thank you very much, and it's wonderful being there. First, quick check. Can you hear me? Is that coming through?
It's loud and clear, Professor.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Fantastic. Good. Yeah. So it's wonderful being in Indonesia, even though I'm in New Zealand. I, as many of you might know, I have been in Indonesia a couple of times before and had only fantastic experiences there. So I wish I could be with you right there. But this year, of course, it doesn't work the way that we all wished for. But even better than that, you organized a fantastic summer course, a summer school that works very well. And I saw your list of speakers, which was absolutely fantastic. So I feel honored to be part of it. And I hope I can bring you a little bit of those things that are valuable to you. So I was asked to talk about marine wildlife tourism, and that is something that is close to my heart. And I've been working on it for 20 years now, 20 odd years. It is something that I love doing, and you will probably see in today's presentation as well that it shines through. So without further ado, I will share my screen now and go through the PowerPoints and video slides that I have prepared for you. So I hope you can see that now. So marine wildlife tourism, when we look at wildlife tourism in general, so we have this quote here by a gentleman called Olindo. He is actually from Africa, from Kenya, and this quote is not directly related to marine wildlife tourism, but to wildlife tourism in general, in particular in Africa, to safaris, of course. But wildlife is a magnet, and we know that. Wildlife has been a magnet for many years. People do want to see wildlife. They want to see wildlife in the most diverse environments, in different forms, with different vehicles, with different equipment, and so on and so forth. And we will go in the first part of today through a little bit of those interactions we have with wildlife, and also what kinds of wildlife tourism we have. Then after that, we look a little bit into the management of wildlife tourism. And again, only relatively briefly, we could talk a whole week about that. There are so many models and so many good ideas out there how we can manage wildlife tourism. And then the last part is a little bit about case study that covers my work mostly, but not entirely. So we will have a look at that one and see how we do time-wise. So if you look at this one, again, an example from Africa, so not marine related, but I think very telling. Often when we interact with wildlife, we have and for lack of a better term, a quite ignorant tourist who comes and says, look, I'm here, tell the wildlife I'm here and I want to see them now. I want to get close, I want to have a reliable sighting, and you organize that for me. And of course that doesn't work. And of course it is what we would call ecotourism, because it's more about myself rather than the wildlife that we want to see. So we have a whole bunch of different people that look at wildlife, from this type of tourist to very hardcore specialists who are traveling around the world to see a specific species or a whole bunch of different species or so. So that is then the other end of the spectrum. And again, we have a look at those now. But before we look even at tourism, we look at I want us to have a quick look about our interaction with wildlife in general. And that is a very wide spectrum, as you can see here. Let me see if I can get a laser pointer. Yep, there it is. So on this end here on the left-hand side, we have very high interaction, physical action with wildlife, and that goes down in continuum. And on the other hand, we have virtually no interaction whatsoever. And if we look at it, the high interactions, hunting, culling, predator control. So be aware that when we're talking about things like that, that's not always necessarily negative. Even if we're killing wildlife, that can be predator control. For example, in many places around the world, we have deer hunting or rabbit hunting or so, because those species become so prevalent and overtake the environment and are real pests and destroy other species or the flora in a country or in a region. So they need to be controlled, and therefore to an extent also need to be killed. We, in the marine environment, have seen, for example, the crown of thorns starfish. You might have seen reports on that one, that those starfish are incredibly invasive and kill lots of other native wildlife in that marine environment, on the coral reefs in particular. Then we've got live captures, for example, for marine parks, dolphins and seals, and even whales to an extent. For display purposes and entertainment purposes. Research, of course, can be very diverse, and we have also some criticism about research, saying, we advocate that tourists don't get close to wildlife and don't touch wildlife and so on, whereas research can be quite invasive at times. But over time, that became less and less invasive. We have new models, new technology to do research where it doesn't have to be as invasive. And then we have what is the main part of what I'm talking about, the non-consumptive recreational use. So for tourism, for recreation, and non-consumptive. And we will talk about non-consumptive, what it means, but basically in a nutshell is you don't kill the animal, but you observe it or interact with that. And then we have on the lower side here, conservation and lobby group membership. So if you're a member of World Wildlife Fund or Greenpeace or any of those groups. And then an interesting one here, you might not even be aware of it, but we also have the existence or bequest value. And that is something that's actually quite interesting. You, for example, might have never been to Africa, but you might still think it's important to protect elephants or lions. Tigers are not in Africa, but lions, for example, even though you have never seen any in their real environment, nor might you for the rest of your life, but you still value that wildlife there. So you have no direct interaction whatsoever. You don't see it, you don't interact with it, you don't touch it, don't observe it and so on, but you still value that wildlife. So this is just a little bit of an overview to show you what kind of spectrum we have. Now, when we're defining wildlife tourism, that is already a little bit of an issue sometimes. And David Newsom and colleagues in their book defined it as viewing of all non-domesticated vertebrates. And you might be aware of vertebrates and invertebrates, the difference. It's sometimes a little bit of a language issue, but the invertebrates are often, or usually small animals like insects and things like that. And interestingly, David Newsom and Kate Roger and Ross Dowling, who wrote that book, do not include that in wildlife tourism. And it's a bit surprising. Firstly, they acknowledge in their book actually there's an interest in such operations. So we will get back to that one as well. You will be quite surprised what kind of wildlife we are sometimes viewing, even on a commercial basis, so on a wildlife tourism basis. So when you look at data, it's often very hard to find. So you see this set of data, those few points here, quite old. If you look at the year here, the International Ecotourism Society, but it shows you, it gives you an idea roughly what we are talking about. And when we look at the second bullet there, the Ecotourism Society says 40 to 60% of all international tourists are actually nature tourists. And nature tourists are not necessarily all wildlife tourists. You can just go hiking in nature or mountaineering or things like that. So you're not a wildlife tourist. But out of those other 20 to 40% are actually wildlife related. Yeah, so, and again, that is quite old. So if we're looking at more recent data, if you could find something, you would feel that it is quite an increase in that number. Where we do have some figures to a certain extent when we're looking at marine wildlife is whale watching. And whale watching includes also dolphin watching and interacting with porpoises, which are similar to dolphins, very small marine mammals. So it includes all those three subspecies. And we had reliable data until 2009. So we had one by Erich Hoyt, who is a very, very prolific researcher who published a report in 2001, and then O'Connor and colleagues in 2009. And that's the latest real reliable data. And they actually said we had like about 13 million in 2008. And then again, we can only estimate from those reports and extrapolate and try to figure out from so many places around the world in terms of whale watching, how many roughly we have. And we're looking at about 20 million at the moment. Yeah, so that is a huge amount of people. If you look at them, and that is just whale watching. So whales, dolphins, and porpoises. So that does not include any other marine wildlife, from seabirds to manatees and dugongs, to turtles, to sharks, to other fish like manta ray, and so on and so forth. So all those different types are not even included in that. So you can see it's a massive, massive amount of people who are watching, and also a massive amount of businesses. And if you look at a map, wherever there are whales and dolphins around the world, usually you have also whale and dolphin operations, so commercial watching. Wherever it's commercially possible, viable, then usually is where it's also happening. And I looked at, again, David Newsom's book to have a bit of an idea. Again, I mentioned some different species. So they give you just some examples of wildlife tourism. And out of this table they presented, I highlighted in bluish color there, all the ones that are coastal and marine related. And you can see that pretty much half, if not more, of all those activities are actually marine related. You can see even, again, when I say it's not just whale watching, you will be surprised sometimes what kind of wildlife viewing is actually available. The red crabs on Christmas Island are super famous. Not huge numbers because it's quite tedious to get there, but it is nevertheless very well known and is portrayed in wildlife documentaries and so on. Snorkeling for fish, scuba diving, of course, with whale sharks in various areas. So they here mentioned Ningaloo Reef in Australia, but you know, possibly in Indonesia there are sites. In the Philippines, for example, there are sites where we will get back to a little bit later, and so on. Stingrays or other rays, manta rays, and so on. There's lots of places around the world. Feeding sharks, shark cage diving, and so on. South Africa, in Florida, in Fiji, in Hawaii. There are many places as well where you can do that. And then turtle tourism, from looking at the hatching places, so various beaches, but also snorkeling with turtles. Turtle hatching stations, and so on. So there's quite a bit around there as well. Crocodiles, when we're looking at saltwater crocodiles. So in Australia, we have saltwater crocs, otherwise there probably wouldn't be marine tourism. When we're looking at marine tourism, we usually do not include freshwater, so lakes and rivers are not part of it. Seabirds, many places around the world. Boat trips in wetlands. Probably the most famous example is the Everglades in Florida. I will show you a photo of that one a bit later. You know, albatross colony in New Zealand, again, seabirds, and of course our mammals. We have, again, cetaceans, but also pinnipeds, so that's sea lions, seals, elephant seals, and so on and so forth. So again, a huge amount of different activities. So it's very widespread. So when we're trying to make sense and you know, if you look at science or research and tourism, we do that just as much as others as well. We like to put things into boxes. We like to categorize things, and basically so that we have a better understanding of it, but also it's easier to grasp the ideas and look at how various parts of our industry are interacting with each other or related to each other. So this is a famous model, WBT, as wildlife-based tourism, and Reynolds and Braithwaite published that in 2001. It is an attempt. Let's say it like this. I believe there is actually, that is not quite accurately portraying what wildlife tourism or what the other parts of tourism here are about, but at least it's an attempt. So if you look at, for example, ecotourism, it's entirely within nature-based tourism. And the vast majority of ecotourism does take place in nature, sure. But I would, for example, move this bubble here in this Venn diagram out of nature-based a little bit as well. We have, for example, urban ecotourism. So in city centers, like walking tours or so. So ecotourism is more than just nature-based tourism, right? That's just one example. You can argue for quite a few of those boxes that it's not quite fitting, but it is a good idea, and you see where the overlaps are. So often rural tourism, so wildlife tourism, because we're looking in the natural habitat, it's usually related to rural tourism. But again, we just talked about captive wildlife, so marine parks, aquaria, they can be right in the city center, not rural at all. Yeah, and we will talk about consumptive tourism. I mentioned that, and nature-based tourism in general is obviously much more than just wildlife-based tourism. So there's a number of categories, and when you look at literature, you find so many different ones. So don't take this as gospel here. This is just one idea to, again, put things into boxes to probably understand it a little bit better. And the first one would be nature-based tourism as a wildlife component. So that is usually something where you go on a nature-based tour, be it a hike somewhere, or in this case, in the photo there, a canoe tour or so. But the target of that tour or the reason for that tour is not wildlife, but you might encounter wildlife, like those guys in that canoe there. They're going on a kayaking trip or canoeing trip and then suddenly encounter a couple of moose there. And that can happen with, in our marine environment, a harbor cruise. We have here a bit further north in the Bay of Islands, we have harbor cruises there in the bay, and you do encounter dolphins occasionally. So you're not going out, they're not even licensed to go whale watching or dolphin watching. But if the dolphins are showing up and are next to the boat or close to the boat, that is absolutely fine, because that does not breach the license they have, because they're not looking for them. Yeah, so those are a lot of tours like that. And even on a hike, you might just see a bird in the tree or a squirrel on the ground or so. That's all wildlife, and you encounter it without particularly looking for it. So the second one is an interesting one. Those are locations with good wildlife opportunities. And they're often, let's say, man-made or enhanced, like the bottom left photo. That's a classic example from Africa, where lodges, often quite expensive lodges, have actually a watering hole, and then early in the morning and late in the evening or so, you can, as a tourist, sit there on the deck and watch wildlife. So those are wild animals, usually in a national park somewhere or in a game reserve, but they're wild, and they come because water is there, and tourists can watch them there. And again, back to our marine environment, the bottom right, we have places around the world where you can actually observe whales and dolphins from land. So this is not necessary to go out by boat and charter a boat or go on a tour or so. As you can see here, we have whales. I believe this one is in South Africa, but we can do that also in Australia. There are spots in Hawaii. So there's a number of points around the world where whales come very, very close to shore. The third one are our artificial attractions, and today's class is not really about that. I would usually do an entirely separate one on that. So we're looking at marine parks and at aquaria in particular. So like this photo here, that's marine land in Canada, where you even have beluga whales, but you often have dolphins, you have orca, sea lions, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, other than the marine mammals in aquaria, you have fish and seahorses and starfish and all those different creatures there. Number 4, and I said I'll get back to you, and you will be surprised sometimes what you see. And those are specialist animal watching tours or activities. And often they're called as special interest groups or special interest tourism. And it's said that bird watching is a good example. Sometimes I believe now that bird watching is actually so popular that's not necessarily one of those specialized tours anymore. That became almost a mainstream, and in some cases even almost mass tourism, depending what kind of birds and where you are. But I show you an example now that I bet you probably have never heard of as a tourism activity. And I took that one off that's an entry in the Encyclopedia of Tourism in Coastal and Marine Environments. And you can see here dragonfly tourism. Yeah, so you have dragonflies and there are tours to watch dragonflies. So something you probably never would think about, but there are actually activities like that. Today is probably there's every single creature you can think of has some sort of specialist tourists who are after them, looking for them and observing them, and in many cases, even commercial operations. They can be very small. They can be tiny with just like a handful of tourists or so, but generally they do exist. And the next one are habitat-specific ones, and I mentioned the Everglades before. So those are tours where you need a specific vehicle to observe wildlife. And the Everglades here is a prime example. You see that boat here with a flat hull and a huge propeller in the back. The Everglades are a huge swamp area. And if you would go with a normal propeller-driven boat, like a propeller underwater, you would get stuck immediately. It's very shallow waters, and you see lots of plants here. You would not get anywhere with the boat. So this one has, again, a very flat boat, has no deep draft, and is propelled by an air propeller. So you need kind of a vehicle that does not get stuck in those environments. Another example would be in Churchill and Manitoba, for example, when you go polar bear viewing, they need specific vehicles with massive tires, because otherwise they would get sunk in swampy areas. A normal 4x4 or four-wheel drive is not enough. They would get stuck as well. So they have those specialized vehicles to see polar bears there. So this is, again, a very highly specialized tour, and often also very expensive because the equipment is expensive. Number 6 is thrill offering tours, and prime example there is, of course, shark watching, shark diving, shark cage diving, anything that is seen as potentially dangerous. It's not necessarily dangerous, but it is potentially dangerous, or at least it's seen or perceived as being dangerous. We talked about it in many other areas of adventure tourism or so, where people say, oh, they want to offer thrill, they want to take risks and so on. But the reality is that 99.9% of those people who are doing it want a very safe risk. So they want to have the perception of risk. But of course, none of those people who are going here shark swimming or shark diving also want to be bitten or worst case scenario, killed by a shark. So it's something that is just giving us thrill. It's perceived as dangerous, but they want it safe. Yeah, no tourist usually would want to risk it that bad that you are real at danger. And then we have got hunting and fishing. We mentioned that. So that's part of tourism as well, from fishing in particular. And then again, predator control, for example. So there's a number of activities, and many of them are actually quite controversial. Some are seen as benign, and it's okay if it's not overfished. Others, like here in the big picture, you know, fishing for those really big species also is seen by many as not appropriate. Then there's also what is often referred to as catch and release. So you fish, you catch the fish, take it off the hook, and then let it back out into the water. And people say that's fine because they throw the fish back into the water and they don't kill the fish. There's arguments from marine scientists, biologists saying there's two problems with that. Firstly, fish, like most animals, can feel stress. So being caught in a hook, they can be stressed, they can be hurt. And in addition, there's some evidence that up to 80% of those fish you throw back into the water then die within the next 48 hours because of that stress. So while the tourists think, oh, I throw the fish back into the water, I don't kill it. In fact, they do kill it, but they don't know it. Yeah, so those are just some discussions there, and I leave it up to you and to your morals and ethics whether you find that normal or acceptable or not. So I will not pass judgment on that one. So I said we are going back to consumptive versus non-consumptive wildlife. So what is it? What does it really mean? Traditionally, when we're talking about consumptive wildlife activities, that means consuming that species or that animal, and that means killing it. Right, so that is a traditional view, and therefore tourism is always or has always seen as non-consumptive, because other than hunting tourism, we do not kill that animal that we watch. However, and the positive part of it is that point here, attention is often given to the point that if you do it properly and have non-consumptive wildlife tourism, then the income from tourism is very, very positive. The financial benefits that can be for local communities, but that can also for the managing. So if you, for example, have national parks or marine parks or so, they need to be managed. So the managing organization Park Service, in the US, NOAA or National Park Service. Here, for example, the Department of Conservation, they need to be funded. And part of that funding can come from wildlife tourism. Also, you might have heard quite a bit, a certain species, an elephant or a shark or a whale or so, is worth much more alive than it is dead. So if you catch it, for example, a whale, and consume it, so sell the meat for food and sell the blubber for oil and sell the bones for carvings and jewelry and so on, you have a one-off sale and that's it. But if that whale lives for 60, 70, 80 years, every year in wildlife tourism, it generates a lot of money. And that is much, much more than the one-off money you get from killing that animal. And you can see economic calculations on a whole bunch of different species where researchers and scientists say the wildlife is worth more alive than it would be dead. So what we have with non-consumptive tourism, though, is that this notion that tourism is seen as non-consumptive is actually not quite as valid. If you look at Wilks, the source I give here is from 1977, so really old, probably older than most of you who are watching now. So it's been around for a long time. And very early on, Wilkes already said, this is a myth. It just is not true. So non-consumptive users, and he did research in Canada on Vancouver Island and natural areas there. And he said non-consumptive users, so-called non-consumptive users, are actually consuming recreational environmental resources. They trample, they even if they are very careful and you walk or swim somewhere, you startle wildlife that is being disturbed. Breeding patterns can change because of that, because there are constantly people walking by or going with boats past an island where seabirds are breeding, or where people are swimming with dolphins, like in Hawaii all day. So that disturbs wildlife and eventually even can kill wildlife, even if it's not direct, the activity as such. But then, for example, they might not find food enough, or they're being disturbed while hunting for food all the time, and so on and so forth. So eventually, you might even kill wildlife. So that tourism, wildlife tourism, is inherently non-consumptive, we can't say that. Some is, but lots of it is not either. And if you look at the bottom left, the small photo there, you can see sea lions there and tourists very, very close to it. And this is in Australia, so it's not an Arctic environment or polar environment, but there has been a study in Alaska, for example, where seals were congregating on ice floats. And boats came by, passing by, tourist boats watching them. And every time a boat came by, at least some of those seals were then going into the water because they were scared, they were disturbed, they went into the water. Boat passes, and then shortly after that, the seals went back onto that ice floe to rest. And that happens multiple times a day. And what it means, and especially in a cold environment like in Alaska, that every time a seal has to go into the water and haul out afterwards again, it consumes energy. And that's not energy they're meant to consume, because that's not their natural behavior. Their natural behavior would be lying on and resting on that ice float for much longer. So what it means is they might have not enough energy then for successful hunting if they're constantly disturbed. So that was one of the studies where it was shown very clearly that tour boats have an impact on wildlife, even though they don't touch them, they don't kill them, but there's a detrimental impact on them. Another example is when you look at the numbers of people. This is an example from Maui in Hawaii. And if you look, that is the island here from the harbor here. The whale watch boats go out during whale season when in the northern winter from Alaska, the whales migrate down to Hawaii and give birth and nurse their whales. And then in the northern spring, they migrate back to Alaska and they feed there. So the whole winter season, they do not feed at all. There's no food around Hawaii in warm waters. They need cold waters for krill, for example, tiny organisms that they feed on, and they're in cold waters in Alaska. But in winter, Alaska is too cold for them to give birth and rear their calves. So they travel for thousands of kilometers twice a year, once down to Maui to the warm waters, and then in spring, when it warms up a little bit in the north, then they migrate back. So that is Hawaii. But what also is in Hawaii, there is a small crater, mostly submerged crater called Molokini. And you can see it here. So here is a harbor roughly, so it's not too far away. And this is a nice sheltered spot there with with coral reefs and lots of wildlife to see, from turtles to fish and corals and so on. And when you go on a normal tour, you can see here a few boats already. Look how many people there are. Yeah, so at any one time in the water, there's so many snorkelers. Not any single one is a problem. But if you have so many at one time, then it can become a problem. And that we have in many cases. And that's why we often have, for example, for whale watching, regulations that there's, depending what country you're in, what place you're in, what species of whale you're looking at or dolphin, you have maximum 3 boats at a time around a whale or a pod of whales, but not more. And then if a 4th one would come, then the first one that arrived has to leave. Yeah, so that you never have more than a certain number of people or boats around a certain place. And you can imagine that is sometimes hard to manage. So here's that article. I put that link in you. I believe you will get the PowerPoints in your material. There's actually 2 links. You can also Google it easily. There's a full article that Wilkes wrote, but then there's also an abbreviated version, like a summary or so. Have a look at that one in your own time. The summary is perfectly fine, just to give you an idea what kind of problems tourists can have. So that was the first part. Now let's have a look at managing marine wildlife tourism. And as I said before, we need to manage it in one way or the other. Otherwise, we run the risk of disturbing or in any way harming the wildlife we actually want to see. And the photo there is actually not too far from you. That's south of Yogyakarta. And it is a small town. At the moment, I can't remember the name of it. And there's a turtle hatching station. And what they do is actually absolutely fabulous. So firstly, what they do to manage wildlife tourism, or to manage the turtles, actually, the protection of the turtles, is firstly, traditionally, local people have collected turtle eggs for food. So what they did now is from a NGO, so a non-profit organization that runs the turtle hatching station, they actually pay the local people for the turtle eggs. Say you can still collect them, but you don't eat them. You give them to us and we pay you for it. And then you can buy other food for it. And then they take the turtle eggs to the hatching station and hatch them. And when they become a few weeks old, by law, they have to be released. They're not allowed to keep them longer than, I think, if I remember right, than 6 weeks, but I might be wrong, might be a little bit longer. Then they have to release them. And what they do in order to raise awareness, they make it a tourism attraction. So they have a bunch of tourists, they draw a line here in the sand, and they give a tourist in a half coconut shell, give a baby turtle, and then tell them how to release them. And then the turtles are being released. And all those little dots here are baby turtles going towards the water and are being released. So that is one of the options to manage that. So you manage the tourists by keeping them in place there. Don't let them accidentally step on a baby turtle or so. Stay behind that line. But you also manage it by telling tourists what the problems is with turtles, what threats they are exposed to, and what we can do to help. And the amazing part of it is an eco-village, an ecotourism village there, and they do a lot of different things. That's only one of the activities. Other activities, we went along the beach and collected rubbish. Lots of things like flip-flops and straws and plastic bags and so on, collected tons of rubbish there, and then they dispose of it properly. So they give you rubbish bags, and when the rubbish bag is full, you bring it back to them, and then they take care of it. Another thing what we did there is planting mangroves. So each gets a mangrove or two, and we go to the shoreline there where it's necessary, and tourists are actually planting mangroves. So you involve tourists in the restoration, in the protection of the environment. And that is obviously also a learning factor, but it's also a feel-good factor for people. They feel really good. And if you see this turtle experience here, people had tears in their eyes. They were very, very touched by it. It's a really touching personal experience, and that is it's very valuable for those people. So again, I mentioned at the very beginning, there's lots of different models and ideas on how to manage wildlife. I'll introduce you to two that are probably in the marine environment, the predominant one, actually three. The first one is Duffus and Dearden. So Dave Duffus and Phil Dearden, both from Vancouver Island, University of Victoria there. They have long time ago worked on it, and in fact both are retired now, so they've been really, really predominant researchers in that area, and they actually created a model based on three other models. And if you're a tourism student, you will certainly heard of the last one, the tourist area life cycle. If you are in recreation and leisure studies somewhere, you certainly have heard of the second one. And if you're more in a probably in a resource management part or so, then you have probably heard of the first one. But I will quickly, very briefly explain them to you as well, so that you have an idea. So the first one is the limits of acceptable change. And that model is actually based on the assumption that whatever is happening in the environment, there's a certain change happening always, over decades, over centuries, over thousands of years. Part of it is evolution, but part of it is also climate change. We had ice ages before and so on. So I'm not talking about the human-induced climate change that we are worried about at the moment, but normal, regular climate changes, but they were much slower over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And again, evolution is part of it, erosion, all those things happen naturally as well. So that is a change, and this is a darker box here that is always happening, and there's no influence by humans. And then on top of it, we have human-induced change, and that is those two white boxes. And the first one is the one where we say, yes, we do have some impact, but it's acceptable. It is not killing the wildlife. It might not destroy the habitat. We have some sites and maybe relocate wildlife, or we manage how we access wildlife or so. So that is acceptable. It doesn't threaten the species. It doesn't threaten the animals that are being viewed or so. So that's what we can do. And then we reach a point, and that is this line here, where then the change becomes unacceptable. So that is the change, and where we actually have detrimental effects on wildlife. There we destroy habitat, where we disturb or even kill wildlife, and so on and so forth. And what the limits of acceptable change tries to figure out, based on mostly science, but also expert opinions and also social sciences, where this line is. So how far can we go with our activities in tourism and wildlife tourism before we reach that point? So to stay within this area so that we do not have detrimental effects on wildlife. So that is basically a gist of the first one, very, very simplified. The second one is Brian's leisure specialization continuum. And Brian looked at it from a fly fishing activity, so not marine, but water-based. And Brian, again, is a very early model. Those three are very early models that are then later on have been modified and merged into Duffus and Dearden's model. But Brian basically found that amongst fishers, we have a continuum. So each of us could be fitting somewhere on this continuum. So you might be here and your neighbor might be there and somebody who's a friend might be here. So anywhere here, every single person can be placed. And the one extreme is the so-called expert specialists. So those are the hardcore fly fishers who have often years of experience, have massive amounts of knowledge. They go out every weekend, every free time or so to do their activity. And then on the other end is the so-called novice generalists. So those are those what we would probably refer to more as mass tourists, but it doesn't have to be mass tourists. I would say if I would go now fly fishing somewhere on my own or just with a friend, I would be absolutely somewhere here. I've never been fly fishing before. So I'm a novice generalist, but it's just two of us going. So it's not mass tourism, but it's often the characteristics of mass tourists, so that they have less knowledge and less engagement with that particular activity. Yeah, so that is that part of Brian's continuum. And then the third one, again, if you're a tourism student, you must have seen that before. That's a 101, but for the others, it's very easy to understand as well. So what Dick Butler actually said in his continuum, and in his tourist area life cycle, he actually based it on the marketing model of the product life cycle. And you might have heard a product has a certain life cycle. If you invent a new product, it takes a bit often to get into the market. Then maybe it becomes really popular if you're lucky. And then eventually the market might be saturated or a new product is replacing it and so on. And it gets to a point where it's either stabilizing or is even declining and is not attractive to the market anymore. And Butler looked at it from a tourist destination. So if you have, let's say in our case here, Maui in Hawaii, say, well, initially there was very little tourists. So here are the tourism numbers and this is a timeline here. So initially very few tourists, tourists and also providers. So accommodation providers or tour providers explore tourism, it's new, get slowly involved and so on, and it's developing. And the further we go in the timeline, the more it develops. And this curve can obviously go that way or very steep if it's something incredibly taking off, or like this as a sort of average example. And then we come to a point again where the market is saturated. So Maui sees how many million tourists a year, and accommodation is there, and all the tours are there, and so on. And then you come to a point where you reach that maximum, and then there's various options, and those are those options. So either ideally you rejuvenate your product, so the destination gets some new attractions or some massive marketing campaigns or so, and can then revive their destination here in A or B. Or it stays pretty much the same. So we reach a certain number, a few million a year, and every year is the same. So we don't grow anymore, but we also don't decline. Or worst case scenario, obviously, we decline because it's not attractive for some reason or the other. As an example, the Canary Islands, for example, they are Spanish islands off the African coast. They were amongst the first package tour destinations in Europe. So when in the 70s, 1970s, package tourism with cheap charter flights took off, the Northern Europeans from UK, Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, France, and so on, they all flew to the Spanish islands. It was cheap, it was affordable, good climate, especially in the shoulder and winter seasons and so on, extremely popular. What happened there, as it was all over the world, really, with emerging destinations, lots of hotels were built, and quite frankly, lots of ugly hotels were built. Those high-rise buildings, white concrete blocks with hundreds of rooms in there, which worked very well. But eventually in the 90s, then tourists didn't want that anymore. Tourists got more experienced and they went to different places as well. And they just had different tastes. They didn't like those white concrete blocks anymore. And the Canary Islands had like a massive decline. So then over the time, they tried to rejuvenate their image with sustainability activities and so on and so forth. And now they are at a good space, always talking pre-COVID, of course. At the moment is an absolute disaster, but that's around the globe. But so that happens to a tourist area in one way or the other. So back to Duffus and Dearden, they put those models together in one. So all three. And they did that in order to understand wildlife tourism, the development of wildlife tourism, and also the impacts wildlife tourism has. And you see Butler's life cycle here, of course, taken from Butler's model right away. And then they have here the expert specialist, novice generalist. So that is Brian's continuum. And this is symbolizing the continuum. And you can see initially when tourism is new, and especially wildlife tourism is new, we have mostly expert specialists. Yeah, so those are only people that go off the beaten track, looking at specific species and so on. It's not easily accessible. That wouldn't be in Hawaii, where hundreds and thousands of people are there. So they go there. And then when the tourist destination develops, more accommodation, maybe an airport will be built and so on, then this continuum shifts from expert specialists all the way longer here in this direction. So we have like a mix of expert specialists and novice generalists. And then later on, we have actually more generalists here, and the experts are not coming anymore. We call that also recreational succession. So at some stage here, those people who came here initially will fall off and go to the destination. Then it's too crowded, and we don't want to see that anymore. And then, of course, the limits of acceptable change. So they have different levels here where they then define, okay, here it's acceptable, here might be just the borderline, and Lux 3 might be, for example, where we're going too far and we have unacceptable change, so we have to do something about it. So this is basically the gist of Duffus and Dearden's model. So another categorization is what Mark Orams did. Mark Orams is a colleague of mine here at AUT and is probably the marine tourism expert. I just actually have here his book. That was the first book on marine tourism in the world, actually in 1999, that Mark Orams wrote. And he proposed 4 different types of strategies to manage marine wildlife tourism. And those are regulatory, educational, economic, and physical. And what I did actually a few weeks ago, I sat down with Mark and asked him about that to explain it a little bit. And that's what I'm going to show you now. So I hope it works well, including the sound. And listen what Mark has to say. I mean, it's great having the person who is actually proposing it. So hearing it directly from him rather than repeating what he is doing. So have a look. There's obviously a need to manage it in one way or the other. And in your book, you outlined 4 main potential tools to manage it. Can you walk us through those tools and see
how we probably in New Zealand as well adopt them or have adopted them already?
Yeah, sure. Now, when we come to looking at managing these interactions, and I always have an objective or an aim, what we're trying to achieve with management is we're trying to minimize the potential negative impacts and we're trying to maximize the benefits. So the intent of what we create from a management regime is to achieve that outcome. And we have a whole range of tools and opportunities to do this. Now, the most common one, and it's almost the default, and I think that's unfortunate, is to use regulations. So I call those the regulatory category or types of management strategies. So to give you examples, those are things like the creation of laws that say you must not do something, or that you're restricted in terms of when you can do it or how you can do it. And if you transgress those laws or those regulations, there's some kind of punishment. So an example of that might be you're going out to interact with and watch dolphins, and the regulation says that you must not approach closer than 100 meters and you must proceed at 5 knots within 300 meters in terms of boat speed. If you are found to be transgressing that, there's some kind of fine. So there's a regulation that says here's what you can and cannot do, and if you don't obey, there's some kind of punitive response to that. So that regulatory approach is very common, and it's something that we're really familiar with. We know that if we drive in excess of the speed limit, which is a regulation, and we're caught, then there's some kind of punishment as a consequence, right? Demerit points on your license, a fine financially, removal of your license and your ability to drive if it escalates. So that regulatory approach is quite common. I think the challenge with that is if we always go to that, we detract from one of the really wonderful parts of interacting with the marine environment, and that is the freedom to actually engage with not just marine creatures, but the sea in a way where we don't have the same kinds of restrictions that are placed on us in a land-based kind of situation. So I would advocate for using regulatory approaches as perhaps the last resort, as opposed to jumping to those as the first response to try and minimize the risks and maximize the benefits. On the other end of the spectrum, the educational approaches are ones that are able to persuade through education people to make choices themselves to minimize their negative impact in terms of their actions and interactions in the marine environment. And those are things that add value to the experience so they can maximize the benefit. If people understand that, to give an example, like going into a particular ecosystem or habitat that's an important resting location for a particular marine wildlife species, and they are encouraged to be very respectful, quiet, calm, at a distance, and to observe through binoculars or through long telephoto lens camera capture of images and so on, and they choose to do that, that actually adds value because it reduces that negative impact or the propensity for it. It adds to their understanding of the animals that they are interested in and their critical part of their life cycle and their ecosystem. So that kind of approach is sort of a win-win, if you like, as opposed to you must not do this, and if you do, you're going to get punished. It's we want to encourage you to understand the impacts of your decisions, and so let's do the right thing by these animals that you're so interested in learning about and observing or interacting with. So there's this sort of two ends of the spectrum, I suppose. Another category are what I would term economic. So one of the things we know about shaping human behavior is that we respond to economic incentives and disincentives. And that's used in a punitive sense in the example I gave before about you transgress the speed limit, you get caught, you get a fine. So you don't want to do that because money is important to us. So we can use economic aspects in association with regulation or with educational strategies to be a disincentive for things we don't want to see. But also on the other side, we can actually use it as an incentive. A good example might be, we know that marine litter is an increasing problem, particularly plastics in the marine environment, causing massive issues for not just marine wildlife, but the entire marine ecosystem. And so we could do something like have for a particular coastal walk or a particular bay or a particular harbour, a group of tourists who are encouraged to go and remove or pick up a whole series of plastic litter from the ocean and they fill up a particular bag, they get a discount from the tour that they're going to go on, or they get some other kind of incentive or reward. So those things people respond to because there's an economic incentive and they feel good about doing something that's the right thing to do. So I encourage us to think of economic management strategies, not just in terms of the punitive aspect of finding somebody or charging them a premium for particular experiences or activities, but on the other side as well, of how can we incentivize and encourage appropriate activities. So the fourth category is what I term physical, and we have a number of ways where we can design, build, and manage structures or vessels that allow us to minimize the negative and maximize the positive. So an example of that might be, and I mentioned earlier on in the previous segment around looking at negative impacts, the challenge associated with marine noise. We have technology now that allows us to choose propulsion units and hull designs of vessels that are much, much quieter. Electric propulsion units, for example, and so on. And so we can take that as a strategy where we might encourage marine wildlife tour vessels and incentivize them to use those kind of propulsion units to reduce the negative impact of marine noise. That's an example of a physical management strategy applied in that context. Another one could be that we actually use structures in the marine environment that encourage people to use particular areas that are more robust and less sensitive to disturbance. We know, for example, that if we build a pier or a wharf or a jetty, that's something that people will frequent. They will use that for observation, they will use that for recreational fishing, they may use that for a boat docking and other kinds of activities. If we create that physical structure and place it in a location where we know that this is not a sensitive habitat, we can shape the usage to areas that can minimize the negative impact. And we can move that intensity of usage away from areas that might be important breeding locations, resting locations, feeding locations for particular species. So we can look at a creative way of using a suite of options to design bespoke management strategies to allow us to interact with marine wildlife in a respectful way that minimizes the potential negative impact and maximizes the value of the experience for the tourists.
So in summary, we've got regulatory measures, we've got economic ones, we've got educational ones, and we've got physical ones. Now, could you give me a specific example for one of each, ideally in New Zealand, but maybe even overseas, where something like that is implemented where you think, well, that's a good example how you can do it the right way?
Yes. So an example not too far from where we're sitting at the moment is New Zealand dotterels are an endemic shore bird where they are very easily disturbed during their nesting season. And if they abandon their eggs, if they abandon their nest for generally more than 20 or 30 minutes, the eggs become not viable. And so therefore we've got a problem with a species that's endangered and we could move towards extinction. And so they are disturbed by the presence of people, tourists in close proximity, but especially dogs if they bring them along. So only a couple of kilometres from here, what has been done as a combination of things is the physical management strategy is to ensure that that coastal walkway that is quite popular doesn't go close to where the nesting locations are in that foreshore area. So that deliberately channels the usage away from that sensitive habitat. We've also got an educational strategy where we have signs and other information online as well that points out to people that if they choose to go off the path and onto the beach in this area, that there are potential disturbance issues for the New Zealand dotterel that nests there over that particular nesting season. So it's an educational strategy to try and persuade people to understand what they need to do to ensure that those birds are looked after. We also have regulatory strategies in place there where dogs are banned over that particular location year-round actually because of the problems that dogs can cause. So there's a simple regulatory strategy, and if people are caught with dogs in that area, there's a fine. So there's an approach which uses an economic strategy, so a fine, a disincentive associated with regulation, associated with education, and also with a physical design aspect to try and ensure that we're managing that potential negative impact with regard to that shell bill.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what Mark had to say. And those four different regulatory or not regulatory, all management tools can be used separately or in conjunction, either some of them or all four of them, as you saw in Mark's example at the end. So one of the examples that Marco mentioned was education, and that's actually a really important one. And that's also mostly my work is happening in that area. And you often have that notion of leave me alone, I'm on holidays, I don't want to learn, I want to relax and so on. But is that really what the world looks like, or is it just a myth as well? And back in the early 2000s, when I did my PhD work, 1999, 2000, 2001, I actually could clearly show on dolphin tours that people actually wanted to be educated. They wanted to learn, and they actually demanded, whereas other researchers said tourists are just consumers and they don't want to learn. But on wildlife tours, in particular in my case on swim with dolphin tours, people actually expected information. So why interpretation? So Marco mentioned that already, to make people understand what they're watching, to protect them, and to protect the environment as well. So it has this underlying notion of conservation when we're talking about it. Very briefly, for time reasons, Freeman Tilden is actually always referred to as the grandfather of interpretation. So he worked in the American National Park Service, and he was actually developing structured interpretation in those national parks. So some of his quotes that became very, very famous, he said, through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, then appreciation for what you see, and through the appreciation, when you appreciate something, you're also more likely to protect what you see. Another one is, and that's probably the crux of interpretation, it is not instruction, it is provocation. And provocation means provocation to think about what you see, to think what it means, to think in a wider picture, and so on. And we will look into that in a moment. For time reasons, we don't do activity at the moment, but just what's the difference? You heard now educational tools and interpretation. So what is the difference? It's pretty straightforward. Education is usually a more formal approach. So what you are doing at the moment, that's education. You're sitting there, usually in a classroom or now in front of your computers as well. You are what we call a captive audience. So usually, I mean, you're not chained to the desk or being in a cell somewhere in a prison, but you're in a captive class and usually would not just walk off there. In many cases, education involves repeat students. So you come back every week for your course or every day or whatever a course is. And it is usually a little bit more formalized. Where interpretation is informal and takes place usually with visitors, so not with students in a formal setting, but on a tour somewhere or so. It's voluntary. People go travel or go on a tour and they choose to listen or choose to you as a guide. Of course, therefore, it's a non-captive setting. So if somebody is in a national park or so, here's a ranger talking, they can walk away anytime. Yeah, so they have no repercussions in terms of probably not passing assignments or missing out on marks and degrees and so on. It's totally free and informal. And to do that, we have various tools. And the main tool is obviously a guide. Yeah, a guide is always something that is very helpful, especially if it's a good guide. And those 3 photos are all from the US National Park Service. I've chosen them because here, as an example, a ranger that was really good with children. So he could actually relate to children, and children loved listening to him. So he could bring his interpretation down to a level that a child of this age here, for example, can understand and learn from him. This is another one who had a larger group. So he doesn't have that luxury to do one-on-one talks or so, but he talked to a larger group, but he had an absolute gift of having humor. So he used a lot of humor in a good way to explain things and to keep people interested and excited about what he had to talk. And lastly, this one actually talked about data, which is usually the most difficult one. And he did one-on-one. He was just standing there with this clipboard here or this notice board, and then people could just stop and ask him about that visitor data and things like that. In our environment here, this is dolphin tours in Hong Kong, and this lady here with the head is actually a guide. So she stands back a little bit and explains to the people on the tour what they can see when there are dolphins there and so on. That's a standard. I also did a quick talk with Tracy, who is a guide on albatross tours in Calcutta, and I worked with them. And I want to show you now an example where Tracy works with a prop that she uses. And that is a really, really good educational moment as well. So have a look what she says.
What we want to do is try and impart our knowledge on conservation and protection, and actually make people think about, well, here's this beautiful wandering albatross, or here's this beautiful Salvin's albatross. Salvin's albatross are threatened with extinction due to the fishing industry. So what can people on board do to ensure the survivability of a Salvin's albatross, for example? You know, and then we show them the hook pod, because sometimes I feel talking about something, people can't put it into context, but actually, if you actually have a model of it, you show them the long line hook, you kind of open it up and you say, well, this long line hook, or the long lines themselves, can extend for up to 130 kilometers. That's the distance from here to Blenheim. You know, and some people may have driven from Blenheim, so it puts it into perspective from them, or they're driving to Blenheim after the tour. So this long line runs all the way from here to Blenheim. You know, and people are like, wow, that's quite incredible. And then they look at the hook and you talk about the mechanism for how the birds get caught up in the hook and how they drown, and how there's conservation groups that are working really hard to try and instigate mitigation techniques to minimize these albatross being killed. So yeah, we explain how it works, so people can understand it and understand the importance of, when you go to the supermarket, maybe you should be asking questions about how my fish has been caught. Has it been caught sustainably?
Not to put you on the spot now, but do you happen to have a hook pot on board?
I do.
That would be fantastic, because with Lynette we talked about it,
yeah.
And I mentioned it, and she explained it a little bit. You mentioned it, so it is a really fantastic device, and it's something really important. So, like you said, if you show something, it might be easier to understand. So if you have one,
absolutely, it's just right up here. It's just So sometimes it's really helpful if you do have something that you can show people. And we get a lot of people taking photographs of this just because they've never seen one before. So the idea is that, I'll open it up, the idea is you've got the long line and you've got the hook. So you've got up to 130 kilometers of long line. Every meter or so is baited. The hooks are baited with squid. That's the main prey item, or the main food source for albatrosses. So what happens on a normal day is that the birds see the squid, they think it's dinner. They rush in, they grab the squid. For a lot of them, they're very unlucky. They get caught up in the hooks. As the hooks sink, so the birds drown. So around 100,000 albatross were dying every year in long line hooks. That equated to one dying every 5 minutes. So the fishing industry were actually killing the birds at a rate that's faster than what they're able to reproduce at. So there was a huge decline in the numbers and the diversity of birds that we were seeing. So what this is this is the hook pot. It's just a little plastic capsule, very simple concept. is the hook gets enclosed in this capsule. This capsule's got a little pressure release inside it. I've got lines everywhere. It's got a little pressure release inside it. So when it gets to below 20 meters, the pressure release opens up and the hook falls out. I'm not going to do it. That's always the problem when you're trying to live demonstrate something. It doesn't always work. So yeah, the hook drops out. That drops down to 20 meters. It's actually out of reach of the albatrosses. Not for all birds, but this has been endorsed by David Attenborough. It's been endorsed by Prince Charles. It has had a 95% success rate. My company has invested money to install this in a longline fishing vessel in New Zealand as a trial. So it's actually quite amazing that we have this to show people we're actually giving financial contribution. Fingers crossed that the whole of the New Zealand fishing industry adopts this practice and it prevents further deaths of albatross species.
So there you can see, if you have a prop on board and if you talk with a guide and the guide can explain something and to show you something physical, it is much easier to understand. If Tracy would have talked to you about the hook pot without showing you it, I'm not sure if you would have understood what it actually is and how it actually works. So that's just one of the examples. Then we have other forms or tools that we can use. In this case here, those guys are actually not on their cell phone, they are on an audio tour. So they get one of those devices at the beginning of the attraction, and at each part, this is here a nursery pool for trout, for example, there's a number and they can punch in the number here and then can listen to some information about that particular part of the tour there. The most common ones, panels and signs and so on, probably, again, most common, but also probably the least interesting and exciting ones, especially when there's a lot of text. And then you have also hands-on ones, like here a touch pool, where people can actually touch certain shells and invertebrates or so. There's a staff member right there watching it so that they don't harm or take the wildlife out of that little touch pool or pond for too long. Then we have things like displays, like real life-like displays that make something much more lifelike than a photo or a picture or so. We've got interactive displays in museums in particular with touch displays and so on. And even here in this case, activities in an art museum. So they're teaching by involving people in that particular interpretation. So what we know though is an interpretation, and that's where Forrester and Kaufman's model is coming in, and that's the last of the models I want to introduce you to, is that you can break it down into various phases. So Paul talks about, or Paul and Greg talk about the pre-contact, contact, and post-contact phase in order to deliver certain things at certain times on the tour. And look what Paul has to say about that.
A need to approach in interpreting whale behavior from a research perspective in ways that met where the passengers were, what they were expecting, what they knew or didn't know, what interested them, and so on. So part of my responsibility was to develop the interpretation program, to train interpreters and so on. So I originally developed this idea of the anatomy of a whale watch as a heuristic device, and began to realize that when people go on a whale watch, their heads are in very different places at different times of the experience. And I began to learn about this simply by listening to the questions they asked. And I began to realize that at least conceptually, you could divide the trip into before you get out to see the whales, time with the whales, and time going back to the dock. For me, that was the 2.5 to 3 hour opportunity we had to try and sort of educate, engage, and impress those going on the journey. And I began to realize that when people first get on the boat, they're not thinking whales. They're thinking, is the boat going to sink? Does the captain know what he's doing? Where's the bathroom? Is there any food on the boat? Where do we put the baby carriage? All of these sorts of things. So there was this need to orient, calm down, get folks interested, and sort of give some insight as to what the trip would engage. So in what I call the pre-contact phase, it was really important to let folks know that they were on a journey of excitement. We hoped they would see things they had never seen before. We wanted to help them incorporate that into their life view and their understanding of whales. And then when we were around whales, I began to realize that we really had to keep the comments focused on helping them understand what they were seeing and allow them to become agents of their own learning. So I developed a sort of a training schedule that was really focused on helping the interpreters or the naturalists move through the phases of where the passengers were. And I also realized that if our aim was to educate and our hope was to engage and increase environmentally friendly behaviors, that we had to use some learning principles, that we had to understand a little bit about how humans engage with information, how it impacts them emotionally and intellectually, and how to shape that towards a conservation message. But my focus really was on from the beginning of the trip till the end of the trip, and making sure that what we were saying was relevant to their expectations, their emotional state, and so on.
So that was Paul Forrestal, and if you look at literature, he is one of the absolute gurus on whale watching research, and he's retired now, but he was happy to have a chat with me on that one. So his model then was a little bit enhanced by various people. One of them again was Mark Orams, and without going into detail there for time reasons, what Paul just said as well in terms of how to engage people during the contact phase in particular is this point what Mark Orams here said is the effective domain. So something that you want to convey to people that's close to their heart. So things like life and death and birth and threats to the wildlife and so on, anything that is emotional we can relate to, and that is much easier to convey to tourists that are not marine scientists, rather than numbers and figures and data and all that stuff. So again, Marco here said emotions, stories about the animals, life, death, birth, illness, and so on and so forth. So with that, I will go on my own research that I've done. So I told you that before. I said I found that tourists do actually want to learn, but I have not found one single piece of work where people were actually asked what they do want to learn. What I did find, though, is that researchers said often what is conveyed as a message in tours, in guided tours, is opposite to that what people want to learn. It is often content that either managers think it's important, that either policymakers think it is important, for example, also rules and regulations and so on, but nobody asks actually the tourists what they want to learn. So then my colleague Brock Porter and myself, we went on those tours, both in whale watching tours here in Auckland and swim with dolphin tours in Kaikoura. And here are just some very quick quotes of what people told us. So what I've liked more about on dolphins themselves: breeding, lifespan, how far they travel and so on, how many young and things like that. The next one said more about international whale protection progress. Would like to have seen more education for Asians and Japanese, highlighting problems for whales on the way to the Antarctic and what awaits them, EI whaling ships. How they can help change the fate of these creatures they have taken the time to admire on this trip. So again, this is not my research or my words. That is a direct quote from one of the respondents. What is important, though, I quickly go back to Mark's model here, was also this part, opportunity to act. So Mark's argument, and Paul said that earlier as well in his paper, it is not enough just to tell them about the things. You have to also give them an incentive or opportunity to do something about it. And then if you go to that quote, those two short quotes here, people said the skipper told us we are and have damaged the ocean, toxins and so on, but he did not tell us how we could help to repair, or even if we can still repair. And the last quote there as well didn't tell us what we can do to help. So this is clearly underpinning both those quotes, or the previous two as well, underpinning exactly what in theory Paul and Greg Kaufman and also Mark developed and proposed. So it was a really, really good piece of research to underpin what in real life and say, yes, they got it right. That model actually works because it's exactly what people want to learn about. And this is just a whole bunch of things, what we put together from all the comments, and there were open-ended comments in a survey, but also interviews. And those main themes here, again, it's anything that is around emotions and goes close to heart, that came through very strongly. Threats, breeding, number of young, social behavior, nutrition, life cycle, all those things that are close to your heart, they came through the most dominant, as the most dominant themes in our research. And then finally, and I have to rush it a little bit through, is our work on pelagic bird watching. And I have chosen that one over whale watching or dolphin watching or so, because it's something that's probably not as well known. Whale watching is lots published about that. Bird watching, lots has been published also in terms of terrestrial bird watching, but not so much on seabird watching, except for penguins. Penguins, there's quite a bit of work as well. So let's have a quick look at bird watching. Again, I have to rush it slightly. Massively increasing activity. So it's not a niche activity anymore. We have, millions of people bird watching, and the prime markets are the UK and the US. So they travel around the world watching birds. If you have not seen this movie, The Big Year, have a look. Get it, see if you can find it on one of your platforms, be it YouTube or Netflix or wherever. If you can watch that, it's a hilarious movie. It's a comedy, but it put bird watching on a spot. The gist of The Big Year is, over 1 year, bird watchers in the US have a checklist and tick as many birds off that list as they can find in that year. So they travel all across to the outer islands of Alaska to Florida, from the northeast to the southwest and so on, to tick as many different bird species as possible. And who has then the most at the end of the year wins The Big Year. And again, while this is a comedy, it's not so far-fetched that actually that competition does exist. But also as a hobby, people do it. So here, this is a Facebook group on bird watching here in New Zealand. And somebody said, my big day, not my big year, but my big day, a total of 45 different species, all within 5 kilometers of my home. And Northcote is here a suburb in Auckland. So it's even very, very 5 kilometers within the city centers. With city boundaries. So they found a lot of different species here. So we did our work again in Kaikoura and on Stewart Island. Just to give you a quick look, we are here in Auckland, the biggest city. Wellington is our capital. Kaikoura is down here on the South Island, and Stewart Island is here, our third largest island of New Zealand, but compared to the other two, obviously really, really small. So this is what you see, albatross, a number of different albatross species, but also other species as well. Absolutely majestic animals. And I show you a very, very quick overview what you can experience. So you can imagine those birds, the biggest of the albatross have like a 3-meter wingspan. So they're 3 meters. That's massive birds. And it's really, really interesting, even for many people who are not birders as such. So there are lots of people coming as well who are not hardcore bird watchers. I'm not going through that in detail now. Again, you will get the PowerPoints, have a look, but we found through our research certain groups or categories of people. So from people who are hardcore bird watchers, have done it for many years, to the absolute new enthusiasts who are going the first time on this tour. And we decided that on their travel behavior, on the gear and equipment they have, if they have a logbook, for example, they do check their lists and things like that. But what I lastly want to show you as well is something that we found, and I think that's quite important, and it's the ethical part of feeding wildlife. And that's related to us and another study by Jackie Ziegler and colleagues. So Jackie went to the Philippines, where you can swim with whale sharks. And as you can see from those photos, and if you Google that, you find hundreds of photos that are absolutely atrocious. There are those things you should not do with wildlife, right? No proper management. People are hanging around there right next to the big whale sharks, trying to hold on to them, to touch them, and so on and so forth. What was interesting about that study of Jackie and her colleagues was that lots of people actually knew it was bad. But what they did do, and it's a psychological thing, is they're trying to justify their action anyway. And we all do that in our daily life as well. We know we shouldn't do certain things, but we do it anyway, right? So they call that here the guilty pleasure. And what they justified it, some said, oh, it's better than in an aquarium, at least they are free. Others said, oh, I knew it was bad, but I can't judge it if I haven't experienced it myself. So I have to experience this myself before I can judge it, and things like that. So a lot of different comments. And what we found in our study is both tours of bird watching are actually feeding the dolphins, the birds. What those guys in Kaikoura do, they have that bait ball at the bottom there. Here, there is fish liver in there, and that attracts a bird. Yeah, so that's how the birds come to the boat and can be watched very, very closely. On Stewart Island, the skipper occasionally retrieves some piece of fish out of a cooler bag and feeds the bird there like this. So what our study actually did not look at was actually the feeding and the ethics of feeding. We were looking at totally different things, but what came through the comments from many, many tourists is actually that they did not like the feeding, or at least they felt awkward about it and said it was not ethical. But, and don't read them all, but what they also did is they do try to justify it as well and say, well, but they used to fish anyway to boats, because when the fishing boats are coming back, they're throwing fish pieces overboard, and that attracts the birds. Others said it's, because it's fish guts, it's natural food, so that's fine. Others said it's ecologically sound, otherwise they wouldn't have booked the tour, and so on and so forth. And the interesting part again was we didn't even ask for it. They offered it to us without even asking. They had this what we call ethical dilemma. Yes, I know it's probably not good, or it might be bad, but I do it anyway. Yeah, and that is very human behavior. So that's what both studies concluded, that there is actually potential costs. We don't know, because there are no sound biological studies that have been done. And until we have data that shows clearly, no, we should not feed wildlife, or saying, well, it's fine. There is indeed no negative effects on the birds. Until then, we actually should use a precautionary principle and say, no, we're not doing that. So to wrap it up, a few concluding thoughts. I've put you through a long time today. So we know wildlife is a magnet, and that can encompass an all a huge different type of wildlife, from the tiniest little organisms to the largest whales and everything in between. And marine wildlife in particular has grown significantly, mostly because of technological advances. So we have scuba there, we have snorkeling gear, we have boats that are faster, get to certain places faster, and so on. So all those things facilitated a massive growth of marine wildlife tourism. We also have potential impacts. Again, usually if I do a whole course on marine tourism, I would always talk about the potential impacts, both negative and positive impacts, and they need to be managed. And I showed you a few management tools and models that are available. And with all of that, we also have to have some ethical considerations to understand what's right, what's not right, and ethics vary considerably between cultures. What is ethical in China might not be ethical in New Zealand, and what's ethical in New Zealand might not be ethical in Indonesia, and what is ethical in Indonesia might not be ethical in Italy, and so on and so forth. So cultures and countries, through our upbringing and through our cultures, we have different ethics, and that makes it more difficult to pinpoint what we should do or what we can do and what we can't do. So with that, I hope I could provide you a little bit with some information that's useful for you. I was very lucky that I could talk to a number of people recently and film that. They were very happy to provide information. Mark Orams, Paul Forrestal, those are absolute gurus in the field, and we're very privileged having them, but also providing freely the information and talk about their work with us. So with that, thank you very much for having me. And it's your very first one for your summer school now. And I wish you all the best and lots of fun and information for the next how many ever lectures you're going through. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. Before we move on to the discussion session, we have brief information about Schools of Hospitality and Tourism, Auckland University of Technology. So the School of Hospitality and Tourism are world ranked and recognized globally. The QS University rankings place our schools at top of hospitalities and leisure management programs in New Zealand. Our Bachelor's of International Tourism Management is accredited by the United Nations World Tourism Organization, or UNWTO. And there are postgraduate studies includes Masters of Gastronomy, Masters of International Hospitality Management, Masters of International Tourism Management, Masters of Philosophy, and Doctors of Philosophy. And you can learn more on www.aut.ac.nz.
Yeah, Professor, right now, as you can see on the chat box, there are a lot of questions from our participants. Maybe we could help you read one of the questions, or maybe you want to read it yourself.
Yep, I just have a very quick look.
Okay, so there is approximately 23 questions. So maybe we could just maybe answer 2 or 3 questions because we are running out of time.
Yep. So I see one here. Does it mean tourism to swim with stingless jellyfish in Palau and Derawan cannot be considered as wildlife tourism? Yes, absolutely. It's what I meant. The difference between wildlife is, of course, I'm not sure if you're looking at the difference between vertebrates or invertebrates, or the difference between marine and non-marine wildlife. So as I said, invertebrates, I would definitely consider wildlife tourism as well. So from that perspective, yes. from the marine or not marine perspective, I would say it is wildlife tourism as well. Jellyfish are marine fish. I know they're in a lake, but I'm not quite sure if it's actually a saltwater lake or if it's a specific type of jellyfish there that is adapted to fresh water. But I would definitely say it's wildlife tourism, and I would even call it marine wildlife tourism. So let's see what else we have. There's a pretty long one, but the gist is basically about captive dolphins, and that they are in Indonesia, they're being caught to do tricks and to be displayed in private aquariums, causing stress upon marine mammals. How can such things happening in the first place? Does catching dolphins, is that easy? And what can the marine tourism industry prevent things like that to happen again? And it is, again, it's a very, very long one. I do specific classes on that one as well. Catching them is relatively easy. There are places in Japan, for example, but also in other parts of the world where they're being caught, and then transporting them is a little bit more difficult. They usually be transported by air. So they're going into kind of a pool that is transportable, and they're being transported by air around the world, literally. It is incredibly stressful. Keeping dolphins or whales in captivity in those marine parks is totally unethical and totally inappropriate. So that is probably the worst case scenario. And what we can do is, first thing is, each and every one of you just don't go, don't buy tickets. Yeah, if people don't go to those places, then they don't have a financial incentive to keep those dolphins or whales. And then that means they won't be caught. But also the tourism industry is doing quite a bit. You might have heard about the orca in the US that were in captivity, and there were documentaries made about it, huge pressure on the government to regulate it and so on. What happened a lot in Europe in particular is that big tour operators and airlines actually said they're not selling tours or tickets to those marine parks like SeaWorld or Marineland or those anymore. So from the industry side, again, if they don't sell the tickets, then the parks don't have an incentive to have wildlife in captivity, and therefore then hopefully they would disappear. Yeah, there's tons of questions, so I really appreciate that. I'm not sure, maybe if one of you would just copy paste them and email them to me, and I can actually get back with a couple of sentences to each of them tomorrow or so, so that you have an answer. So we're running out of time, but I appreciate your questions, and I try to answer them as best as I can. So if some of you could do that and email it to me, that would be fantastic, and I will get back to you.
Okay, actually we still have 5 minutes left. If you maybe want to answer one last question.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a national standard that the tourism industry needs to follow in building sites that don't have to destroy or change the form of the place? In most places, no. And in most places, there's no specific standard. There are standards for safety, for building materials or so, but overall that it's particularly in countries where we have still problems with bribes, with less regulations, with corruption and so on. There definitely, even if there are regulations in place, often with some bribes you can go around it. On the other hand, there are countries that have building standards, and an example is, after the example I told you about the Canary Islands, Turkey became very, very popular in Europe as a tourist destination. And Turkey said, we don't want to do the same mistake, and maximum height of the hotels is 2 or 3 stories. So not those big high-rise blocks. Well, guess what? Turkey is not immune of financial pressures and corruption either. If you look at Turkey now, you have the same type of big hotels there as well. But they did try initially. The same in Belize and Central America, a small country. They actually have ecotourism. It's the only country in the world that has ecotourism development in their constitution. So it's a very small country and they want ecotourism to foster ecotourism. And I'm not sure of their building standards, but I'm sure there won't be those high-rise buildings other than maybe in Belize City, in the main city, but not on the islands out there. They're small buildings, maximum 2 floors, maybe 3. I haven't seen a 3-story building there. So I think there is a good example where it works.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Michael, for answering several questions from our participants. Maybe after this session, we will collect the questions as you ask, and we will email them to you.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So before we finish the session, is there anyone who want to ask a question? Maybe they can raise their hands.
Probably last questions. Because we have some minutes left. If any participants have questions, you may raise your hand. Only one participant.
Okay, so here we have Doni from. Okay, so here we have Doni, Professor. Doni, you may unmute yourself and ask.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for this opportunity. Professor, I have a question. I'm PhD student in tourism management in Ocean University of China. I just want to know if a mangrove ecosystem can call marine tourism, because my research location in mangrove ecosystem. And what else the information should I put in the strategy? For example, economy, regulation, accommodation, and what else? Thank you for your time.
Hi, Donnie. Nice to meet you. You broke off a little bit, but if I understood right, you want to know what other kinds of management tools you should consider in mangrove settings.
Yes.
I would, for example, say mangrove settings are ideal for something like the physical management tools that Mark offered. For example, boardwalks, because you can't walk through the mangroves, but you can also usually not drive with a boat through it. There might be some canals or channels through it, but overall it's very tight and very small. So I would say, for example, boardwalks and platforms could be a really, really good opportunity for people to see the mangroves, to go into the mangroves without destroying them, because they're kept on those boards and on those platforms and are very contained to a certain area.
Okay. So a visitor going to mangrove ecosystem, can I call marine tourism?
Mangroves, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, marine tourism is usually defined with anything that is tourism in the coastal marine environments that is related to salt water. Mangroves are saltwater, brackish water, but it's definitely part of the marine environment, and therefore it's marine tourism, totally.
Okay. And one question again, from Mark, regulation. What should your solution for me to create the strategy of mangrove management in Indonesia?
Well, again, I mean, the one thing is the physical one. What I think is educational is important as well. If you remember my example from the small town south of Yogyakarta, So they involve tourists in planting mangroves even. So that is an activity that helps the mangroves directly to recover, but also indirectly by educating people, by encouraging to pick up rubbish and explaining to them why the rubbish is problematic, why the mangroves themselves are important as a protection measure for the coastal environment, but also why they're important as a habitat for wildlife.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Luck. If I can, if I have time, can I send you message, email to you, because I have more questions about mangrove tourism.
Yep, send me an email.
Thank you for your time.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Doni. Also, thank you so much, Professor Michael Luke. What an amazing lecture about marine tourism and wildlife. So the last question for Doni is also the last question for our session today. So Professor Michael, we hope we can meet again on another chance.
Okay, I think that's all for today's agenda. Today's such an eventful day. But before we finish the sessions, I have several informations for all participants of virtual summer program. First, tomorrow is day 2 of our summer program. There will be a lot of interesting activities for you guys to look up to. And also the second lectures from Professor Dr. Suziana and the flashback unpad. Also, another reminder, during the pre-event, you have been informed about our international cultural exchange. So the detail will be given later during the summer program. And then thank you very much to participants who attended the first days of the summer program. My name is Aisha.
And I am Fathan.
As the MC of the event, representing the committee, for the deepest of our hearts, we do apologize if there are any mistakes during the event. Once again, thank you very much for your kind attention. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and
see you tomorrow. Thank you so much, Professor Michael.